At the far edge of Asia, where mountains plunge into sea, lies the peninsula that would one day be called Korea. It is a narrow land with a long memory, wedged between empires, shaped by invasion and sustained by belief. For 2,000 years, every power that touched Asia tried to claim it. None could hold it. The three kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla were more than rivals. They were mirrors of a single civilization, discovering itself through conflict. Their struggle would define the soul of Korea and echo through every dynasty that followed. The story begins here, where faith met iron and endurance became destiny. When the northern kingdom of Gojoseon fell, the mountains seemed to exhale. Centuries of legend ended in smoke as the banners of the Han dynasty rose above its fortresses. Iron met bronze. The old order crumbled. Across the plains of Liaodong, the air carried the scent of burnt pine and wet earth. The silence after a storm. To the victors, the land was another province to tame. To those who survived, it was the shattering of memory itself. Beyond the Yalu River, displaced clans fled into mist and forest. Some carried bronze blades, others only talismans of jade. They told their children that the spirits of heaven had turned their backs, yet somewhere, beneath the ash, the ancestors still whispered. In the ruins of Wangjeom, the Han erected command posts, measuring land by the rod and tax by grain. What had once been the domain of myth became a grid of officials and seals. From this conquest were born the Lelang and Xuantu commanderies, administrative outposts meant to impose the order of the Middle Kingdom on a people who bowed to no emperor. Governors came with scribes and soldiers, teaching the arts of writing, agriculture, and law. Chinese tiles gleamed above new roofs, and Confucian texts were copied by hands that still smelt of the forge. Yet influence cut both ways. Traders from the peninsula brought furs, pearls, and iron. Women wore embroidered robes with patterns unknown in the Han court. Civilization was spreading, but not as planned. It was being remade. Farther south, beyond the shadow of the commanderies, the land breathed differently. There, among fertile valleys and slow rivers, life moved to older rhythms. Tribes gathered around sacred trees and earthen altars, offering rice and song to the spirits. These peoples, Mahan, Jinhan, and Beonhan, were less kingdoms than kinships. They spoke in dialects of the same tongue, traded in salt and cloth, and chose their leaders not by conquest, but by the favor of the gods. Mahan stretched wide across the southwest, a loose confederation of dozens of small chieftains, each ruling a patch of field and forest. Its heart lay in the plains, where the Han River bent toward the sea, a place of rice and reeds. Jinhan, farther east, hid among the mountains that would one day cradle Silla. Its people were miners and smiths, working the ore that shimmered like moonlight in stone. Beonhan to the south faced the tides. Its villages smelted iron and sent it abroad in exchange for silk and lacquer. Through these lands passed caravans from the north, bringing iron tools and bronze mirrors. Along the coasts, fishermen returned with stories of ships from distant islands, the first hints of contact that would one day tie Korea, Japan, and China in uneasy fellowship. Though the commanderies seemed to dominate the age, their reach was shallow. Authority weakened with every league from their walls until only rumor and tribute remained. The farther one traveled from Lelang, the closer one came to something both older and new. Still, the scars of conquest ran deep. Among the exiles from the north, memories hardened into legend. Elders spoke of Dangun, the son of heaven, whose kingdom had lasted for 1,000 years. They recited names: Weman the usurper, Ugeo the fallen king, and swore that their line was not broken but hidden, waiting for time to turn. From these memories rose new leaders, men who claimed descent from the divine, women who dreamed visions of fire and rain. In the vacuum left by Gojoseon's fall, ambition began again to stir. At the edge of the northern forests, one such clan gathered around a young leader named Godumak, whose people would later claim kinship with the line of Jumong. In their winter camps, hunters forged alliances and swore brotherhood. Beneath constellations they believed to be ancestral eyes. From these gatherings would emerge the earliest forms of Goguryeo, though its name was still unspoken. To the west, other fragments of Buyeo clung to survival along the Songhua River, mixing with tribes of Tungusic speech. Each believed themselves heirs to the same vanished glory. Southward, among the Mahan Plains, a different seed took root. There, amid the marshlands of the Han Basin, certain clans began to rise above others, not by divine claim, but by trade and craft. They mastered irrigation, built granaries, and learned the worth of iron, not merely as weapon, but as coin. The Mokji and Biryu tribes became names whispered with respect. One day their descendants would call themselves Baekje. For now, they were farmers with dreams larger than their harvest. Jinhan, smaller and more secluded, was a tapestry of mountain fortresses and spirit shrines. Its chiefs traced their power not to kings, but to shamans who could read the will of heaven through clouds and flame. When they gathered for festivals, the valleys rang with drums and chanting. Each tribe offered its first rice to the gods of soil and river. In time, these rituals would become coronations, the sacred beginnings of Silla's royal line. No chronicler in that age could have seen how the fragments would converge. To the north, the ruins of Gojoseon were becoming something new, hard, martial, defiant. To the south, the federations were learning unity through necessity. Between them stood the Han commanderies, glimmering with foreign knowledge yet doomed by distance and pride. History was not still, it was fermenting. As generations passed, the children of exiles forgot the names of those who conquered them, but not the taste of defiance. Warriors along the Yalu tested their strength against Chinese garrisons. Merchants in Mahan traded more iron than tribute. The lines between tribe and kingdom began to blur. Across the peninsula, people started to speak of kings, though none yet ruled a land entire. In the 2nd century, before the birth of Christ, a pattern emerged that would endure for centuries. The North's hunger for dominion, and the South's yearning for balance. The commanderies, meant to civilize, instead awakened rivals who would eclipse them. Chinese records, written in the cautious tone of bureaucracy, mention rebellious barbarians and new polities. But to those within the peninsula, the age felt less like rebellion than rebirth. Among storytellers, the fall of Gojoseon was remembered not as defeat, but as sacrifice. The death of the first kingdom, so others might rise. Songs told of a phoenix that burned in the north and would be reborn in 3 wings. To the listeners around smoky hearths, these were omens, not allegories. Each tribe believed itself chosen to restore the balance between heaven and earth. In a village near the Han River, an elder once said that the gods had withdrawn because men forgot gratitude. His words spread as proverb. When the sky closes its eyes, the earth must learn to see. And so they did. Fields widened, walls rose, and markets hummed. From shamanic chants to early laws, the idea of kingship began to crystallize, not merely as rule, but as duty. By the turn of the 1st century, the peninsula was no longer a fringe of empire. It was a mosaic of awakening states, each with its own dream of destiny. Leilang still sent envoys to Luoyang, but its borders were shrinking. Mahan grew restive under its loose confederation. In Jinhan, the first dynastic names began to appear in oral record. Along the northern ridges, watchfires marked the growth of Goguryeo's precursors. The old world had ended, but not in ruin. From its ashes came the first outlines of a civilization that would outlast its conquerors. The tribes that once bowed to foreign seals were learning to write their own. And somewhere, between the echo of drums and the whisper of reeds along the river, a new thought was born, that the land itself might one day speak with one voice. In the shadowed north, where the Yalu River wound through frost and stone, a hunter-archer walked out of legend. His name was Jumong, the child of heaven and the river goddess, raised among exiles of the old Buyo realm. When his skill with the bow began to stir envy, his stepbrothers plotted his death. Guided by dreams and omens, he fled southward, crossing mountains where even the wind lost its breath. Those who followed him spoke later of his silence, how he carried no treasure, only a quiver and a purpose that none yet understood. The world he entered was harsh and divided. Between the highlands of the Yalu and the plains of the Taidong lay scattered tribes. The Sono, the Guan, the Jolno, the Guano, and the Go clans. Each ruled its fortress and its river, bound together by trade, broken apart by pride. They had heard of Buyo's splendor, of kings who claimed descent from the sun, but they trusted only the gods of their valleys. Into this mosaic stepped the wanderer who called himself founder by divine right. At first, few believed him. Yet when raiders struck from the east, the archer led the defense with uncanny precision. His arrows fell like rain, each finding its mark. After victory, he refused plunder and instead built a wooden altar to offer thanks. Such restraint, more than triumph, began to draw followers. They called him Chumo Wang, the king who came with destiny. Around him gathered warriors, farmers, and smiths who sought a cause larger than their clans. The fledgling kingdom took root along the middle Yalu. Fortresses rose from earth and timber, their walls marked by totems of sky and fire. The 5 tribes that had once stood apart now shared watchtowers and festivals. Each season, they sent offerings to the central stronghold, grain from the valleys, iron from the forges, and men for the army. In those early years, rule was fragile, a covenant sealed not by decree, but by faith. The people believed that their leader's bloodline linked them to heaven itself, and through him, the land was protected. While the new court organized its rites, danger pressed from all sides. To the west lay the remnants of the Han commanderies, watchful and disdainful of any native power. To the northeast, the restless Xianbei rode through the steppes, testing every border with quick raids. The Archer King understood that survival depended on walls and alliances. He sent envoys to Buyo, bearing tribute and kinship words, yet suspicion lingered. In return came gifts of silk and veiled warnings. Despite hardship, the northern realm grew. After the founder's death, his son Yuri took the throne and built Goguryeo, the first true capital, upon a ridge above the river. There, palaces of wood stood amid fields of millet and pine. Court scribes began to record edicts in the borrowed script of the Chinese, though most still spoke through drums and fire. Ritual and governance mingled. Sacrifices preceded councils, and the voices of shamans guided kings more than the pens of ministers. What distinguished this kingdom from the tribes around it was not only its army, but its idea of destiny. Where others ruled for survival, these northerners ruled for remembrance. Every conquest was spoken of as restoring the order once lost with Gojoseon's fall. Warriors painted the sigil of the phoenix on their shields, claiming they were the fire reborn. The belief in divine descent was no mere boast. It was a system of meaning that justified every hardship. Seasons turned, and the small settlements along the Yalu transformed into citadels of stone. Roads connected them, lined with posts bearing the king's seal. Under King Taejo the Great, the realm extended southward, absorbing neighboring tribes through battle or oath. His campaigns were not of blind conquest, but of deliberate unification. Each captured fortress was rebuilt and garrisoned, each rival chief bound by marriage to royal kin. Gradually, the network of power thickened until it spanned from the Upper Amnok to the Taedong. Across the border, Han officials watched with growing alarm. Reports reached the governor of Lelang, describing a restless power of the mountains that levied tribute from all who lived north of the commandery walls. Yet intervention was impossible. Their own grip was weakening. Traders still moved between them, exchanging grain for metal, but their respect had turned to caution. Within the northern kingdom itself, the shape of rule began to harden. Councils of elders gave way to hereditary offices. The 5 tribes that once shared equal voice were now bound beneath the royal clan, the Go lineage. A court hierarchy emerged, generals, priests, and scribes ranked by proximity to the throne. What had begun as an alliance of need was becoming a state. Religion, too, evolved. The sun and moon, once distant deities, were now patrons of the royal family. Temples rose beside fortresses, their altars heavy with animal bone and bronze cups. In the spring, the people celebrated Dongmeng, the Great Alliance Festival, when the king offered wine to the spirits of heaven and earth. The festival was both worship and politics, an oath renewed each year between ruler and ruled. Through these rites, the land remembered itself as one. As the 1st century unfolded, the kingdom's horizons widened. Scouts reached the Taebaek Mountains, claiming forests and mines. Farmers in the valleys began to use plows of iron instead of wood, a sign that wealth was spreading beyond the court. Caravans from the south brought silk and salt. Northern hunters offered sable and falcon feathers. Each exchange wove the fledgling state deeper into the web of Asia's frontier economies. But progress carried peril. Success bred ambition, and ambition invited jealousy. The Xianbei tribes gathered once more beyond the eastern plain, testing the borders with swift attacks. In the west, the Han commandery of Zhuantu demanded tribute. The young kingdom stood between empire and steppe, too proud to bow, too small to rest. What saved it was not numbers, but cohesion, the shared conviction that they were heirs of the sky. Legends tell that when a lunar eclipse darkened the capital, the priests declared it a sign of divine trial. For 7 nights, the king fasted, standing barefoot in the snow, praying to the heavens for light's return. When the moon emerged, whole and bright, the people believed the gods had answered him. From that night forward, the monarch's title bore sacred weight. Kingship was no longer a matter of bloodline alone. It was a covenant of endurance. As decades passed, the northern state began to radiate confidence. Its generals carved roads through rock, linking fortresses in a chain of vigilance. Farmers cleared new fields where once only forests stood. Children learned songs that named their homeland as chosen among lands. The age of tribal memory was closing. The age of kingdoms had begun. No one could yet foresee how the balance would shift, that one day this northern power would challenge the empires across the sea, or that its murals would still gleam in stone long after its fall. For now, it was enough that a fugitive's dream had taken form. From a vow and an oath, a nation had been born. Morning mist drifted above the Han, silvering the reeds. Boats slid past each other without sound, their oarsmen wrapped in wool and purpose. In those quiet crossings, a kingdom began to remember its reflection. Among the clustered settlements that lined the river's bend, a new court was taking shape. The people called their ruler Onjo, a man who claimed descent from the northern archer king, but sought no glory in conquest. His domain was built not on mountains or walls, but on the rhythm of the water. The Han was both road and boundary. Its tides carried fish, clay, and rumour. From its banks rose the first dwellings of Baekje, mud brick, timber, and belief. Onjo's followers came from many tongues. Some were migrants from Buyo, others from the Mahan Confederation. They spoke differently, worshipped different gods, yet found unity in the promise of fields and trade. The new ruler understood what warriors often forgot, that stability, not victory, fed nations. He marked his capital near the confluence of river and hill, where mist softened the horizon, and the earth held memory of flood and renewal. In those early years, the kingdom grew through patience. Farmers drained marshland to plant rice that glittered like mirrors beneath the sun. Smiths fashioned ploughs of iron and bells of bronze. Markets rose beside temples, and in their noise one could hear the slow weaving of society. The ruler walked among his people without escort, speaking of balance between land and law, between heaven's will and human craft. Baekje's nobles traced their lineages to distant Bayo, but their customs were already changing. The old northern austerity yielded to a gentler refinement. Robes dyed in indigo, feasts of rice wine and poetry. From the Han commanderies came scholars carrying bamboo slips, their characters recording decrees and treaties. To them, the southern court seemed rustic yet eager, a frontier that listened. Within a generation, literacy spread through the ruling class, and with it came new notions of governance. Yet influence never flowed in only one direction. Traders from the islands to the east brought lacquer and shells, while southern artisans shaped earthenware of astonishing grace. The river capital became a crossroads where distant cultures mingled without domination. Songs praising the sun, goddess of Mahan, mingled with prayers to Buyo's sky lord. Together they formed something neither wholly native nor foreign. Across the plains, the Mahan Confederation still lingered, proud and fragmented. Its chieftains held councils that resolved nothing, their alliances shifting like reeds in wind. Baekje grew in their shadow, quietly drawing their villages under its protection. Sometimes persuasion sufficed, a gift of grain, a marriage pact. When words failed, iron spoke. By the end of Onjo's reign, much of the central plain owed him tribute. The transformation was subtle. The Confederation had not fallen, it had simply forgotten the moment it ceased to be. The river defined every aspect of life. In summer it nourished, in spring it threatened. Floods could erase a season's labor overnight, and with them came famine or migration. To guard against disaster, the court ordered embankments and canals, the first collective works of the young state. Laborers sang as they moved earth, their chants echoing through valleys that would one day feed armies. The effort taught a lesson deeper than any decree. Unity was not a word, but a shared exhaustion. As Baekje matured, its ruler sought a language of authority that could command both reverence and continuity. He adopted rituals from the north, the bow to heaven at dawn, the offering of white horsehair to the gods of rain, but infused them with local color. Priests burned herbs from southern hills, and oracles spoke beside willow groves rather than stone temples. Kingship thus became a dialogue between inheritance and invention. In the 1st century after Christ, the court's reputation reached the coasts. Mariners from the distant Yamato Islands anchored in Baekje's harbours, drawn by tales of iron and silk. They brought pearls and stories of sea deities whose tempers mirrored the storms they rode. Envoys exchanged gifts, and in those gestures began a diplomacy that would outlive dynasties. Through such ties, Baekje learned that its river was not the world's edge, but its beginning. At home, the hierarchy deepened. Beneath the throne stood ministers of law, agriculture, and ritual. Record keepers inscribed grain yields and judgments onto wooden tablets. Temples multiplied, each serving both God and government. The court's scholars debated the Book of Odes, translating verses into the soft cadences of their own tongue. With each recitation, the kingdom edged closer to a written identity distinct from its neighbours. Not all prospered in this flowering. In remote valleys, Mahan elders lamented the loss of autonomy. In northern forts, soldiers muttered that the king's peace was built on forgetfulness. Once, a coalition of tribes rose in defiance, burning 2 outposts before being driven into the hills. Their leader's capture ended with a public ceremony of mercy. He was pardoned, not slain. Chroniclers later said this clemency marked a turning point. The ruler who could forgive had learned to reign. The art of diplomacy matured alongside the sword. When the Han commandery to the north demanded tribute, Baekje sent not gold, but an envoy, fluent in both courtesy and irony. His speech praised the emperor as elder brother of the Eastern Sea, while asserting that younger brothers must sometimes chart their own tide. The Chinese official, uncertain whether he had been honored or mocked, accepted the offering and withdrew. Within the capital, artisans found new patrons. Potters shaped slender-necked jars glazed in ash green, the earliest whispers of styles that would later define Korean beauty. Bronze mirrors reflected faces painted with fine white clay. Music changed too. Drums softened, flutes lingered longer on each note. The kingdom was learning grace, that delicate armor stronger than bronze. Religion deepened with prosperity. The people still honored river and mountain spirits, yet whispers of another faith arrived from the continent, a doctrine of compassion and rebirth carried by wandering monks. They spoke of the Buddha, of karma that bound all beings, of enlightenment as freedom from endless war. The court listened politely, neither embracing nor rejecting, but something in those teachings would take root in generations to come. By the middle of the 2nd century, Baekje's influence reached the western coast. Merchants sailed from its ports toward the Yellow Sea, returning with silks from the Waylands and copper from the Shandong mines. Inland, roads linked distant provinces, patrolled by soldiers whose discipline impressed even foreign envoys. The kingdom no longer depended on the prestige of Buyo or the tolerance of commanderies. It stood by its own right. Still, the river remained its heart and mirror. Each spring, nobles and commoners alike gathered on its banks to launch paper boats bearing candles. The flames drifted downstream, offerings for ancestors and lost kings. To watch them vanish into night was to glimpse the future's promise and peril alike. A kingdom forever in motion, carried by current, sustained by depth. Historians would later call this the era of beginnings, when Baekje learned to turn geography into destiny. The mountains guarded its back, the sea awaited its ships, and the Han sang endlessly through its fields. Power here did not erupt. It accumulated, patient as silt. From that patience would rise an empire of art and faith, one that believed the gentlest element, water, could wear down stone. And so, while the northern world armed itself behind granite walls, the river realm perfected a quieter strength. Its story had no thunderous birth, no divine arrow loosed from heaven. It began instead with reflection, of sky upon water, of man upon his own heart. In that stillness, Baekje found the grace that would make it endure. Long before dawn, drums sounded in the valleys of the southeast. Mist clung to the hills like breath, and from the high ridges, fires answered one another in slow succession. The people of Jinhan were gathering, not for war, but for a birth foretold. In a clearing ringed by sacred stones, elders watched a light shimmer upon the ground. From that glow came an egg, the color of polished amber. When it cracked, a child emerged laughing, unafraid. The women wrapped him in woven flax. The men bowed. They named him Goguryeo, the Bright King. It was said that his first cry silenced the crows for 100 leagues, and the river bent its course to witness. Such was the beginning of Silla, though no one then spoke the name. The boy grew among shepherds and hunters. His step was measured, his speech rare, his gaze unblinking. When he came of age, the tribes gathered again. They saw in him something both human and other, the calm certainty of one who had walked between worlds. At his coronation, shamans burned pine needles and intoned the words that would guide Silla forever. Heaven above, soil below, the king between. The early realm was a confederation more spiritual than political. Its villages sprawled along the Gyeongsan River, encircled by low hills that seemed to guard their destiny. Each tribe kept its totems, tigers, cranes, tortoises, and sent tribute not in taxes, but in prayers. The ruler's task was not to command, but to harmonize. He traveled from shrine to shrine, presiding over rituals that wove community from devotion. In those years, power was measured by nearness to the divine. The king ruled through intermediaries, priests, seers, and the first noble families who interpreted omens. Their authority was born from lineage as much as merit. Over time, this hierarchy hardened into the bone rank system, the intricate lattice that would define Silla's order for centuries. Blood determined not only birthright, but the horizon of one's ambition. Far from seeming cruel, this stratification appeared natural to its people. They saw the world as layered: sky, earth, ancestor, living, mountain, valley, village, home. The ruler's bones were pure because he bore the sky's weight. Commoners' bones were plain because they carried the earth's hunger. Between them stretched 1,000 shades of duty. It was a theology of structure, and from it, Silla drew its resilience. While other kingdoms pursued expansion, Silla tended to foundations. Fortified towns rose slowly, each built beside a temple or spring. The capital, Gyeongju, began as a ring of thatched halls around a central altar. From above, it looked like an open eye, gazing toward the sea. There, the royal family offered sacrifices to the mountain spirit of Namsan, whose granite slopes would later be carved with countless Buddhas. In this first age, though, the mountain was still the voice of older gods, untamed, faceless, eternal. Beyond the sacred hills lay rivals. To the west, Baekje's traders spoke of their wealth. To the north, the warriors of the emerging Goguryeo tested every border. Silla had neither numbers nor iron to match them. What it possessed instead was cohesion, a quiet discipline born of shared ritual. When raids came, every household offered one son and one sack of grain to the defense. The armies were small but steadfast, fighting less for victory than for continuity. Trade with neighboring tribes brought iron tools and foreign customs. Envoys from the Han commanderies introduced written script, though for generations the court relied on oral law. Inscriptions carved on wood and stone began to appear, naming officials, recording oaths. To the people of Silla, writing was not merely communication, but incantation. Letters carried spirit as surely as prayer. Seasons passed, and the rhythm of the realm deepened. Each spring, the festival of the first plough filled the valleys with song. Farmers, nobles, and shamans joined in procession, circling the fields 3 times to bless fertility. The king himself drove the first furrow, his hands upon the plough as symbol of unity between ruler and soil. Afterwards came feasting, dance, and contests of strength. These rituals were more than celebration. They were rehearsal for endurance. By the 1st century after Christ, Silla had learned the language of permanence. Timber halls gave way to stone foundations. Roads were laid from Gyeongju to the coast, lined with milestones carved with the royal emblem of 3 curved blades. The court dispatched emissaries to Mahan and Baekje, offering peace where war would have been futile. Through cautious diplomacy, the small kingdom survived between powers far greater than itself. Legends tell of Queen Aryong, the consort of the founding king, who was born from a dragon's body in a mountain pool. When she died, a white rainbow arched over her tomb for 7 days. Such stories were not embellishment, but statecraft. Through them, the monarchy wove myth into legitimacy. To question the ruler was to question the sacred itself. In Gyeongju's workshops, artisans learned to cast bronze bells, whose tones carried for miles. Clay figurines of animals and guardians appeared in tombs, mute attendants for souls on their journey. Music, too, changed. Reed pipes accompanied hymns to the spirits, and chants evolved into measured verses that would one day form the first Korean poetry. The kingdom's modest scale fostered an intimacy between court and people. When drought struck, the monarch stood barefoot on the riverbank, praying until rain fell. When plague came, shamans led processions through the streets, their drums steady as heartbeats. Survival was communal. A pact renewed each hardship. To outsiders, Silla seemed a minor realm of pious peasants, but within its ritual order lay quiet ambition. Each generation refined its governance, codifying duties, ranks, and ceremonies. Even neighboring rulers began to note its reliability. Traders from Baekje found fair weights in its markets. Envoys from Goguryeo found honor kept in its treaties. Respect grew, then caution. The power that conquers slowly is the hardest to unseat. Toward the end of the 2nd century, whispers reached the capital of a new faith traveling down from China, a teaching that spoke of mercy and awakening. Few understood its scriptures, but its imagery of lotus and light resonated with the old mountain cults. Monks traveling under merchants' guise left behind amulets carved with unfamiliar symbols. They found welcome among scholars who sensed that heaven's silence might be filled anew. By then, Silla's horizon had widened. Fields stretched farther each year, and the hills around Gyeongju glowed with tomb mounds, gentle arcs that mirrored the rising sun. The people had begun to believe that their land was itself sacred, a vessel chosen by destiny. From that conviction would come the endurance that later bound the peninsula under one crown. Still, in this first age, the kingdom's glory was still humble. A plowshare in fertile earth, a bell tolling across mist. A king born from light and legend who taught his people to bow, not from fear, but reverence. Silla's strength was not in conquest or wealth, but in the unbroken rhythm of faith. When twilight descended over the sacred hills, fires lit the terraces one by one. Their glow moved like constellations across the slopes, each flame a promise that the night would end. From that quiet brilliance, The kingdom endured, small, devout, unshakable, awaiting the dawn it knew would come. Across the Korean peninsula, time began to move with new precision. Kingdoms that once breathed in legend now measured their lives in harvests, edicts, and wars. The scattered tribes of an earlier age were fading into memory, replaced by courts, laws, and the slow machinery of state. What had been mere survival became ambition. In the north, the mountain realm of Goguryeo tightened its grip under King Taejo the Great, a ruler whose authority stretched beyond kinship. He reorganized the 5 tribes into administrative provinces, binding chieftains by oath and tribute. His word became command, his frontier, the edge of every neighboring fear. Soldiers trained year-round in fortress cities, their discipline as hard as the stones they guarded. From the Yalu to the Taidong, smoke rose, not from chaos, but from industry. Iron for weapons, timber for watchtowers, grain for armies yet to march. Each campaign expanded more than territory. It expanded identity. Northern chronicles spoke of the people of the high walls, united by language, law, and pride. The age of scattered clans was ending, and with its passing came both strength and solitude. Farther south, Baekje was learning the subtler art of endurance. King Goi, remembered as the lawgiver, codified ranks and rituals, transforming a loose confederation into a true court. His reforms defined noble titles, dress codes, and the duties of officials. Justice, once a matter of vengeance, became procedure. Punishments were recorded, decrees sealed with royal emblems carved in jade. The transformation was not merely political, it was aesthetic. The court's attire shimmered with silk imported from China. Its architecture rose in measured symmetry. From the river capital, envoys traveled north to offer courtesy and south to secure trade. Baekje's diplomacy was woven like cloth, each gesture binding potential enemies in threads of civility. Among its scholars, the teachings of Confucius took root, emphasizing order through virtue and hierarchy through decorum. Yet even as they studied foreign classics, the courtiers reinterpreted them through native sensibility. The ruler was not only a moral exemplar, but the living soul of the land. In that synthesis, Baekje found a cultural confidence equal to its military might. To the east, the valley kingdom of Silla remained cautious. Its rulers built alliances instead of empires, cultivating resilience behind a veil of humility. While its neighbors waged campaigns, Silla fortified its passes, planted rice, and refined the hierarchy of bone and rank that bound its nobles to the throne. Every official knew his place, and in knowing, preserved stability. The capital of Gyeongju grew from a ritual center into an organized city. Roads radiated outward like spokes from a wheel, connecting shrines, workshops, and farms. Bronze bells summoned not only worshippers, but also administrators. Religion and government spoke the same rhythm. That harmony gave Silla a quiet advantage. Its people obeyed without coercion, because order felt divine. Relations among the 3 kingdoms were a web of rivalry and recognition. Trade persisted even during hostility. Baekje's craftsmen exchanged pottery for Goguryeo's furs, while Silla's iron tools traveled both directions. Envoys carried gifts and veiled threats alike, speaking in the formal language of brothers who might draw swords at dawn. At the heart of this age was imitation transformed into invention. The Han commanderies, though weakened, remained beacons of continental culture. Their bureaucratic models, writing systems, and ceremonial forms filtered southward. Yet every adoption came with adaptation. Korean scribes wrote Chinese characters with regional flourishes. Architects blended Han geometry, with native roofs curved like wings. Foreign influence ceased to be dominance. It became vocabulary. Religion, too, was shifting. Shamanic rites still ruled the countryside, but whispers of Buddhism reached the courts. Travelers and monks from Liaodong told of a path beyond violence, a way to transcend the turning of kings and wars. Their sutras were not yet fully understood, yet their images, a lotus rising from mud, a smile undisturbed by time, captured imaginations weary of conquest. The new faith would not triumph soon, but its seeds had been planted. In Goguryeo, power hardened into tradition. Kings ruled as warrior priests, their coronations marked by sacrifices to the sky. Stone fortresses dotted the mountains, their walls merging with the landscape as if grown from it. Generals began to carve their names into rock, the first traces of historical memory written in stone rather than legend. Each inscription declared that they were more than men. They were custodians of destiny. Baekje followed a different path. Prosperity fostered art. Artisans adorned tombs with murals of birds and dancers. Potters shaped vessels whose elegance rivaled anything from Luoyang. Music flourished at court, its rhythms blending river chants with imported melodies. The kingdom's strength lay in grace, its power disguised by beauty. Silla, slower to display splendor, built inward. Its rulers established hereditary offices, formalized land ownership, and constructed the first archives. Monks copied Chinese classics by oil lamp, even as shamans performed rites before the same flame. The coexistence of old and new defined the kingdom's resilience. It could evolve without rupture. Throughout the peninsula, the idea of kingship itself transformed. No longer seen as divine incarnation alone, the monarch became mediator, between heaven and people, between tribe and state. Authority required wisdom as much as blood. Councils of ministers emerged, advising rulers and preserving continuity through succession. Governance matured into craft. War never vanished, but it grew purposeful. Skirmishes along the Taidong or Han valleys were fought not for plunder, but for prestige. Each victory proclaimed legitimacy. Each defeat demanded reform. Battles were recorded with precision, their causes debated by scribes. History was becoming a mirror in which kingdoms judged themselves. In this tightening age, identity deepened. The people of Goguryeo saw themselves as mountain-born, stern and loyal. The citizens of Baekje took pride in refinement and diplomacy. Silla's folk valued endurance and faith. Diversity, rather than division, became the peninsula's strength. Three visions of civilization coexisted, each certain of its destiny, each unaware that their rivalries would one day forge unity. By the late 3rd century, the peninsula stood at an inflection. Commanderies to the north crumbled under pressure from nomadic incursions, freeing Korea's kingdoms from centuries of foreign oversight. Trade routes now linked them directly to Chinese states and, through maritime paths, to Japan. For the first time, they were not peripheral. They were participants in the theater of Asia. Peace was rare, but progress unrelenting. Irrigation expanded farmland. New metallurgy techniques produced stronger blades and finer ornaments. In Baekje's workshops, artisans experimented with gold leaf. In Goguryeo, engineers cut tunnels through cliffs to channel rivers. Every act of creation proclaimed permanence. When winter winds swept down from Manchuria, each realm lit bonfires on its borders, signaling vigilance rather than fear. They had survived the age of myth and invasion. Now they stood on the threshold of history proper, aware of their power and wary of its cost. The peninsula no longer whispered, it spoke with three voices. One echoed through mountains, one along rivers, one within sacred hills. Together they formed a harmony, rough yet undeniable. The next centuries would test that harmony, bending it into rivalry, greatness, and grief. But for now, the kingdoms held their ground, their banners steady in the long wind of time. Snow swept down from the northern plains, wrapping the walls of Goguryeo in silence. Inside, torches burned against the stone, and men in wolfskin cloaks bent over maps carved from birch. The kingdom once born of exile had become an engine of conquest. What began with a fugitive archer now stretched across the roof of the world. Under King Mission, Goguryeo broke the last chains of the Han commanderies. Xuantu fell first, its garrisons outmatched by an army that knew every gorge and pass. Lelang followed, abandoned by imperial troops too weary to fight in endless frost. When the final banner was torn from its towers, the people of the north lit fires that burned for 3 days. For the first time in centuries, the peninsula's spine was free of foreign rule. Independence, however, was not rest. The new rulers understood that survival required motion. Fortresses multiplied along rivers. Roads linked valleys once isolated by snow. Tribes of hunters and farmers were drawn into the state's orbit, taxed and trained. The realm's borders became arteries, carrying grains south, soldiers north, and ambition in every direction. The court that emerged from this victory was austere and disciplined. Its monarchs dined in silence before the ancestral altar, their garments simple save for the emblem of the rising sun stitched in gold. Ministers recorded harvests and levies with a precision foreign to earlier ages. Beneath the solemn ritual pulsed the certainty of destiny. The northern land was no longer a refuge, but a throne. From this order rose a ruler whose name still commands awe, Goguryeo the Great, the conqueror who carried his kingdom beyond the horizon. He ascended the throne in youth, and by the time his beard had darkened, half of Manchuria marched beneath his banners. Chronicles describe him as tall, fierce, and unyielding, but his genius lay in vision as much as valor. He saw that the north could not thrive behind walls. To the west, steppe tribes threatened every season. To the south, rival kings plotted revenge. His answer was expansion, a tide that would drown uncertainty in triumph. Campaign followed campaign. Across the Amnok, his cavalry thundered through valleys thick with fog, seizing fortresses once deemed unreachable. To the east, he subdued the Sushen tribes, pushing Goguryeu's borders to the frozen coast. The court poets likened him to a comet, unpredictable, radiant, brief. Wherever he rode, fortifications rose in his wake. He left governors in conquered lands, not marauders. Those who yielded kept their customs, but swore loyalty. Those who resisted were scattered into the wilderness. He understood empire not as devastation, but as order imposed upon chaos. Yet conquest alone could not sustain dominion. Goguryeo cultivated a new nobility, loyal to the crown rather than clan. He rewarded soldiers with land, artisans with silver, and scholars with authority. From this meritocratic seed grew a civil structure that balanced might with administration. The empire's heart was martial, but its mind was bureaucratic. Diplomacy mirrored warfare in audacity. The king sent envoys to Chinese courts, addressing emperors as equals, not subjects. In one letter to the Northern Wei, he wrote of 2 suns sharing heaven. The metaphor shocked courtiers, but encapsulated his creed. Goguryeo was no longer a fringe state, it was civilization itself. The South learned this truth painfully. Baekje's frontier outposts fell one after another, and the Han River basin trembled under northern assault. the court of Baekje, refined and eloquent, found itself writing letters of truce rather than poetry. Even Silla, long shielded by geography and diplomacy, bowed to northern pressure. Its king offered gifts of gold and horses, seeking peace through submission. Goguryeo accepted and returned protection, a vassalage cloaked in alliance. Behind these triumphs lay relentless labor. Roads were paved with stone slabs cut from mountain quarries. Messengers rode in relays to carry orders across hundreds of miles. Granaries filled the valleys, guarded by soldiers who understood that hunger was deadlier than any enemy. The machinery of empire, once imagined only in Chinese chronicles, now pulsed within Korea's own soil. Art mirrored ambition. Tombs of kings and generals became monuments of scale, vast mounds ringed by carved guardians, their walls painted with tigers, dragons, and celestial dancers. These murals were not decoration, but declaration, testimony that the rulers of Goguryeo believed themselves chosen by heaven's wind. In one, a mounted warrior spears a demon beneath a blazing sun. In another, a phoenix rises from storm clouds. They are the visual scripture of an age intoxicated with victory. Prosperity, however, carries its own omen. The capital's markets overflowed with tribute: silk from China, pearls from Japan, amber from the Amur. Nobles feasted beneath banners embroidered with gold thread, their armor replaced by brocade. Among the common people, tales spread of a king who spoke with thunder but walked unseen. Myth was overtaking man. Toward the end of his reign, exhaustion began to haunt the empire's edges. Endless campaigns demanded more soldiers, more grain, more faith. The conquered grew restless and the loyal tired. Goguryeo himself pressed on, driven by an unspoken dread that stillness would invite decay. In his final years, he led one last march against tribes to the northwest. He never returned. His tomb, a colossal stone pyramid in Jian, bears an inscription of his deeds: 66 campaigns, countless victories, peace secured by might. It stands to this day, weathered yet legible, a nation's boast carved into eternity. Beneath its shadow, the succession passed to his son, King Jiangsu, who moved the capital south to Pyongyang, transforming the mobile empire into a seated one. Under Jiangsu's careful rule, the expansion slowed, but the realm solidified. Temples rose beside administrative halls. Scholars compiled histories in brush and ink. The once roving army became a disciplined instrument of defense. The warrior empire had matured into a civilization. The contrast between father and son mirrored the kingdom's evolution, from fire to flame, from conquest to permanence. Yet even as peace returned, the echo of Goguryeto's ambition lingered. His name became invocation and warning alike, a reminder that greatness demands endurance few can sustain. Across the peninsula, rival courts measured themselves against his legacy. Baekje sought refinement to counter brute strength. Silla found faith as armor against despair. The northern colossus had forced its neighbors to define themselves. In its shadow, they began to dream of their own ascendancy. For Goguryeo, the 4th century was an age of pure momentum, its banners bright against the horizon, its soldiers hardened by snow and victory. Yet history would remember it not only for its conquests, but for the paradox it embodied. A kingdom that reached farther than any before it, only to discover that empire, like winter, cannot last forever. When the snows returned each year and covered the tomb of its greatest king, the wind that howled through the mountains sounded like distant applause. It was said that in those nights, the spirits of the fallen rode with the storm, guardians of a realm that had touched the heavens and dared to call it home. From the western hills, the capital shimmered like a reflection of sunlight upon water. White walls encircled its palaces, tiled roofs curved like wings above the river plain. The sound of chisels, looms, and chanting monks blended into a single rhythm, the music of a civilization at ease with its greatness. This was Baekje in its ascendancy, when the realm seemed touched by refinement rather than ruled by force. At the center of this flowering stood King Junchogo, a monarch of rare equilibrium. He ruled with both discipline and charm. His reign remembered not for brutality, but for brilliance. Where other kings measured glory in corpses, he sought it in continuity. Under his vision, Baekje became the bridge between worlds, the cultured intermediary linking the peninsula, the continent, and the islands beyond the eastern sea. In his time, the kingdom's reach extended from the Han River basin to the southwestern coast. Garrisons protected trade routes, harbors filled with ships heavy with grain, silk, and lacquer. Envoys crossed the sea to the Yamato court, carrying bronze mirrors and Buddhist scrolls. In return came pearls, fine swords, and young nobles eager to learn Baekje's arts. To Japan, the Western kingdom appeared as teacher and elder. To China, it was a polished neighbor, neither submissive nor defiant. Diplomacy was only one measure of its success. Within the capital, artisans and architects worked with purpose that bordered on devotion. Stone pagodas rose tier upon tier, their corners tipped like the wings of cranes about to take flight. Sculptors carved guardians whose faces mingled serenity and vigilance. Bronze casters shaped bells that sang with the purity of wind through pine. Every craft seemed touched by a single aesthetic truth. Beauty was not decoration, but order made visible. The introduction of Buddhism transformed that pursuit into philosophy. Monks from the southern Chinese dynasties arrived bearing texts written on silk. They spoke of compassion, impermanence, and the cycle of rebirth. These teachings resonated with Baekje's gentle temperament. Temples multiplied along the riverbanks, their courtyards filled with incense and debate. The royal court embraced the new faith without abandoning its ancestral rites. Harmony, not replacement, became doctrine. Religion shaped architecture, but it also refined conduct. The monarch styled himself not only as sovereign, but as moral exemplar, a bodhisattva upon the throne. Ministers were urged to govern with mercy, generals to conquer without cruelty. In practice, ambition and idealism often collided, but the aspiration itself ennobled the age. Chroniclers later called it the century when the kingdom spoke with both wisdom and grace. Art mirrored devotion. Murals in royal tombs depicted lotus blossoms and dancers poised between heaven and earth. Potters discovered glazes of pale green that caught light like dew. Jewelers set gold with inlaid glass and amber, crafting diadems that sparkled as if woven from sunrise. Music, too, reached new complexity. Flutes joined zithers in pieces that alternated between joy and longing. Scholars likened these melodies to the kingdom itself, luminous, precise, and fleeting. Beneath the brilliance, discipline remained firm. The legal codes established under King Goi matured into a sophisticated bureaucracy. Officials recorded harvests, taxes, and births in careful script. Regional governors reported to the capital by sealed dispatch, ensuring unity across far-flung provinces. The strength of the kingdom lay in this balance, aesthetic refinement underpinned by practical governance. Relations with neighbors reflected that same duality. Toward Goguryeo, the court displayed cautious respect. The two kingdoms, once bound by kinship, had become wary equals divided by memory and ambition. Skirmishes flared along the northern border, yet both sides knew that open war would consume them. Each instead sought advantage through diplomacy, letters, marriages, and gestures calculated as precisely as military maneuvers. To Silla, Baekje extended alternating hands of friendship and command. Trade flourished between them, yet both understood the delicate nature of peace. When Silla's rulers adopted Buddhist symbols in their ceremonies, Baekje's scholars took quiet pride. Imitation was the sincerest acknowledgement of influence. Through religion, art, and craft, Baekje's culture flowed eastward, shaping the soul of the peninsula long before politics could. The sea carried this spirit even farther. Merchants from the south sailed under banners embroidered with golden swirls, sign of Baekje's royal charter. Their ships reached the coasts of China, where markets of Guang and Jiaoji welcomed them. In their holds, they carried fine ceramics, gilt ornaments, and writings that praised enlightenment over conquest. To distant observers, Baekje seemed a kingdom of artisans, guided by poets. Such harmony, however, hides its own peril. Prosperity breeds complacency, and art can veil decline. As generations passed, court nobles grew enraptured by ceremony. Feasts extended for days. Ministers competed in displays of erudition rather than policy. The royal treasury glittered, yet frontier garrisons went unpaid. Beyond the palaces, farmers began to feel the weight of taxes that fed the capital's brilliance. Meanwhile, the northern power watched. Goguryeo expansion under King Gwanggaeto pressed relentlessly southward. Fortresses that had stood for decades fell within months. The Baekje army, elegant in armor but fragmented in command, struggled to resist. Each defeat shook confidence more than territory. Refugees fled toward the coast, carrying tales of northern cavalry that moved like storms. King Jeonchogo's descendants fought to preserve the realm's dignity. Some sought alliance with Silla, others turned again to the sea, relying on diplomacy and trade to offset military weakness. The kingdom's artistry continued even in adversity. Temples repaired, monuments built. But a quiet anxiety crept through the capital. The poets began to write of impermanence, not as philosophy, but as lament. In one surviving verse, carved on a stone stele near the river, an unknown monk wrote, "The moon adorns the water, but the water flows away." It was both observation and prophecy. For all its grace, Baekje could not escape the current of history. Its elegance was its strength and its vulnerability. By the 5th century's end, the balance that had defined the peninsula was shifting. Goguryeo's banners cast their shadow deep into Baekje's northern provinces, while Zilla's steady reforms promised endurance. The river realm that once guided the arts of Asia now found itself fighting for breath. Yet even in retreat, Baekje left a legacy unmatched. Its architects taught Japan how to raise temples. Its monks carried scripture across the sea. Its artists set standards for beauty that endured long after its walls fell. To the world beyond, the kingdom's end seemed a loss. To history, it became illumination, proof that civilization's truest mark is not conquest, but grace. As twilight settled over the Han Basin, the wind moved softly through ruined courtyards. Bells still rang from distant monasteries, their tones lingering like memory. They did not mourn, they reminded. For every sound was an echo of what had been. A kingdom that once believed beauty itself could hold the world together. Evening sunlight lingered over the slopes of Namsan, painting the stone altars in copper light. From the terraces of Gyeongju, monks' chants drifted across the fields. mingling with the scent of pine and tilled earth. The kingdom that had once knelt to survive was beginning to stand. During these centuries, Silla changed not through conquest, but through quiet transformation. The foundations laid by faith and discipline began to bear fruit. While its neighbors reached for glory through the sword, this realm learned to rule itself from within. Ritual became administration, devotion became policy. From that slow alchemy emerged a power unlike any the peninsula had seen before. King Naimul, who ruled in the early 4th century, understood that strength could not come from isolation. His reign marked the kingdom's first great act of diplomacy. Ambassadors traveled north to Goguryeo and across the sea to China, returning with silk, texts, and techniques. Through exchange, Silla gained what others squandered in battle: knowledge, legitimacy, and time. It was also an age of lineage. The bone rank system, once a loose custom, hardened into law. Nobility was measured not only by ancestry, but by service. The king's relatives occupied high office, yet the court's competence rested on administrators chosen for talent. Through this order, chaos found no foothold. Stability became the highest virtue, and in stability lay strength. The city itself reflected the change. Gyeongju's wooden halls gave way to tiled roofs. Its lanes widened to host markets alive with cloth, grain, and bronze. Travelers described a capital neither rich nor grand, but immaculately arranged, a mirror of its people's temperament. Even festivals, once exuberant and chaotic, were now choreographed expressions of unity. Music accompanied decrees, and prayers concluded councils. Religion, once a matter of ancestral spirits and mountain gods, was shifting toward Buddhism. Monks arrived from the Chinese mainland, carrying scrolls of sutras, teaching compassion and the law of cause and effect. Their message resonated deeply with a people long devoted to discipline. The royal house adopted the faith cautiously at first, blending it with older rites. Temples rose beside shrines, not in opposition, but in echo. The image of the Buddha, serene and remote, fit easily beside the ancestral altar. This spiritual transformation reshaped politics as well. Kings began to speak of rule as stewardship, of power as burden rather than privilege. The monarchy's tone softened but did not weaken. Mercy replaced spectacle. Laws were enforced with precision but tempered by conscience. In this, Silla diverged from the models of its rivals. Where Goguryeo's might was visible and Baekje's grace external, Silla's strength turned inward, quiet, patient, enduring. Under Naimul's successors, trade and learning flourished. Scholars studied Chinese classics, craftsmen mastered new metalwork techniques. Iron from Silla's hills supplied weapons for defense and tools for harvest alike. Inscriptions carved onto bronze vessels began to include Buddhist mantras beside royal insignia. The material and the spiritual were no longer separate realms. They were two sides of a single pursuit of order. The 5th century brought both opportunity and peril. To the west, Baekje's fortunes waned. To the north, Goguryeo's shadow loomed larger than ever. Between them, Silla maneuvered with the grace of a reed bending before the wind. When attacked, it yielded long enough to endure. When courted, it smiled long enough to learn. Its envoys spoke gently, but their eyes measured every alliance. Through these delicate maneuvers, the kingdom secured breathing room. Borders stabilized, trade routes expanded, and the court turned its gaze inward once again. Bureaucracy matured into art. Royal scribes recorded not only decrees, but reflections, observations on virtue, governance, and fate. A civilization that had begun in ritual was beginning to philosophize. The transformation reached its most symbolic expression in architecture. Stone foundations spread across the hills of Gyeongju, supporting temples that gleamed with white plaster and bronze spires. The capital's skyline became a dialogue between earth and sky, faith and rule. Pilgrims from across the peninsula came to witness the great halls dedicated to the Buddha of infinite light. Many left with new ideas that would reshape their own lands. Silla's army, though smaller than its rivals, had become a disciplined force. Soldiers drilled beneath banners embroidered with the lotus and the phoenix. Commanders studied both Chinese tactics and native guerrilla arts suited to the mountain terrain. When Baekje and Goguryeo clashed once more, Silla avoided the storm, fortifying its own lands and sending envoys to both camps. Survival was no longer desperation, it was strategy. At court, a subtle confidence replaced the humility of earlier generations. Poets wrote of their homeland as the kingdom of the golden dawn, a phrase that captured both pride and prophecy. Artists adorned tombs with clay figurines that no longer guarded fearfully, but smiled serenely toward eternity. Even the common folk began to feel that they lived in a realm blessed by destiny. Yet prosperity never obscured memory. In the evenings, elders told stories of Baekje and Queen Aryong, of the egg from which their kingdom was born. These myths, retold beside new temples and under new doctrines, reminded listeners that divine favor was earned through endurance. The old gods had not vanished, they had changed their language. Toward the century's end, King Beofyeong codified Buddhism as the official faith. His decree was not merely religious, it was political genius. By sanctifying the crown through a universal doctrine, he lifted Silla above tribal divisions. The kingdom became more than land or lineage. It became idea. Monks joined ministers in advising the throne, and temples became schools for both spirit and intellect. What began as survival had ripened into confidence. The court's alliances reached far, its institutions deepened, and its faith gave it purpose. While the north and west strained under the weight of ambition, Silla seemed content to grow in silence. Yet beneath that calm lay a promise, one the world had not yet understood, that patience could be power and unity could be won, not only by the sword, but by belief. When dusk fell upon Gyeongju, lamps flickered along the palace colonnades. Their glow spread across gardens, reflecting off bronze statues of the Buddha. In the distance, the hills turned to shadow, but the capital gleamed, as though dawn lingered there a little longer than elsewhere. It was said that the kingdom's light came not from its wealth or armies, but from its steadiness, the calm fire of a people who had learned to wait until history was ready for them. A messenger galloped through the mountain pass at dawn, his breath white against the cold. In his satchel lay 3 letters, one sealed in gold, one in wax, one in blood. Each bore a promise, and none would last. Across the peninsula, treaties were written faster than they could be remembered. By this time, the 3 kingdoms were no longer youthful powers testing their strength. They were seasoned rivals, aware that every gesture might tilt the balance of centuries. Goguryeo commanded the north from its new capital at Pyongyang, a citadel of stone and ceremony. Baekje, rebuilt after its losses, regained dignity under King Muryong, whose court revived the Polish of earlier glory. Silla, steady and devout, transformed diplomacy into weaponry. The century unfolded like a game played on shifting ground. Each victory contained its own undoing, each alliance a hidden betrayal. Yet within that uncertainty, the peninsula reached a strange equilibrium, a rhythm of rivalry that sharpened all 3. From his southern capital, King Muryong sought to reclaim the prestige of the river realm. He reopened trade with China's southern dynasties and renewed friendship with Yamato Japan. Envoys crossed the sea carrying Buddhist icons, lacquered boxes, and books of verse. In return came steel and ships, signs that the island kingdom still revered its old teacher. Muryong's diplomacy restored more than Baekje's commerce. It restored its confidence. To the north, Goguryeo's monarch, Jiangsu, son of the great conqueror, had turned his father's empire into a fortress. From Pyongyang, he governed a realm stretching deep into Manchuria. Under his long rule, the state matured into a bureaucratic empire of scribes, generals, and priests. The murals of its tombs no longer celebrated battle alone. They depicted banquets, scholars, and the stillness of a court certain of its grandeur. Yet grandeur conceals fatigue. The weight of territory strained even Goguryeo's iron discipline. Vassal tribes wavered in loyalty, and the southern provinces watched Baekje's revival with envy. The northern court responded by tightening its laws and summoning armies it could scarcely afford to feed. Every triumph left another frontier unguarded. Silla observed and learned. Its rulers, King Beofyung and later King Jinhung, understood that power was not a gift of size, but of structure. They codified Buddhism as state doctrine, turning faith into governance. Monks became administrators, temples became schools, and the moral order of the universe mirrored the hierarchy of the court. While other kingdoms fought to hold what they had, Silla built the machinery that would one day outlast them all. Jinhung, ascending as a young and ambitious ruler, believed destiny favored the patient but rewarded the bold. He reorganized the military, extended the borders northward, and fostered an elite brotherhood of youth known as the Hwarang, the Flower Knights. They were warriors, poets, and devotees in equal measure, bound by vows of loyalty, courage, and compassion. To their eyes, battle was not carnage, but ritual, an offering to the spirit of the nation. These reforms transformed Silla's modest army into a disciplined force. Roads and fortresses followed, cutting through the mountains and linking provinces in a network of authority. For the first time, the realm's borders matched its imagination. Across the peninsula, espionage and diplomacy replaced open war. Marriages were forged and broken to secure advantage. Baekje's princesses traveled to Gyeongju. Silla's princes wed daughters of the north. Each union carried an expiration date written in ambition. Yet through this traffic of affection and deceit, knowledge moved freely. Architects, artisans, and monks crossed boundaries with ideas as their only luggage. The shared embrace of Buddhism created unexpected harmony. Monks from Goguryeo lectured in Baekje temples. Silla novices copied their texts. Even in rivalry, a spiritual kinship formed, a recognition that all three sought enlightenment, though by different paths. For a fleeting moment, art and faith transcended politics. Bronze Buddhas cast in Pyongyang found replicas in Gyeongju. Murals from Baekje inspired frescoes in northern tombs. Civilization itself had become the one true alliance. Still, no peace endures where pride survives. By mid-century, border skirmishes erupted again. Goguryeo, anxious to reassert dominance, sent armies southward. Baekje resisted fiercely, but could not match the north's size. Silla, watching both bleed, advanced quietly into disputed lands, claiming them under the guise of protection. The map redrew itself without a single declaration of war. King Jinhung's campaigns into the Han River Valley marked a turning point. What had once been Baekje's heartland now fell under Silla's rule. Monks blessed the conquest as karmic reward for righteousness. Generals called it justice long deferred. The captured lands brought wealth and new farmland, but also resentment. Baekje's poets began to write of betrayal, their verses tinged with mourning. In Pyongyang, the court responded to these southern shifts with both contempt and fear. Goguryeo rulers saw in Silla's rise the echo of their own youth, organization born from belief. They dispatched envoys proposing renewed alliance against Baekje, but the trust that once bound north and east had evaporated. Every handshake concealed a blade. Through these shifting loyalties, the peninsula's destiny tightened like a bowstring. The kingdoms had reached parity in size and sophistication, yet none could destroy the others without destroying itself. Trade continued even during campaigns. Monks traveled safely through lands their kings called enemy. The paradox of the age was that conflict produced culture as surely as peace. Underneath the pageantry, fatigue spread. Generations had grown up under ceaseless mobilization. Farmers pressed into military service, artisans conscripted to build fortresses. The wealth of courts glittered while the villages thinned. Each state, in its pursuit of security, had become both stronger and more brittle. As the 6th century drew toward its close, a sense of inevitability hung in the air. Goguryeo's vast empire trembled beneath its own weight. Baekje, though reborn, lived under constant pressure. Silla, once the smallest, now moved with the confidence of destiny. The balance that had defined the peninsula for centuries was shifting again, this time toward the quiet power from the southeast. On the eve of King Jinhung's final campaign, he stood upon a high ridge overlooking the conquered valleys of the Han. Beside him, monks chanted sutras for peace, and generals waited for orders that would bring anything but. The king said nothing. He watched the river winding through mist and understood what his predecessors had not. Victory was never permanent, but unity, if it came, would have to be. That night, torches flickered across the mountains as his army moved silently south. In their shadows marched the future, still unseen but certain. The age of alliances was ending. What would follow would no longer be balance, but reckoning. A falcon circled above the stone walls of Pyongyang, its shadow gliding across tiled roofs and empty courtyards. Below, courtiers moved softly through echoing halls, where once the clamor of victory had never ceased. The empire that had conquered its horizon now struggled to command itself. 2 centuries of triumph had hardened Goguryeo into habit. The machinery of rule remained intact. Fortresses manned, taxes collected, borders patrolled. But the will that had once animated it faltered. The empire's strength had become its burden. Every province demanded defense, every vassal tribute. Administrators recorded abundance in ledgers, even as the granaries emptied. To the north, steppe nomads pressed against the frontier, testing walls that no longer inspired fear. To the west, China reassembled under new dynasties, the northern Qi, then the Sui, each inheriting a familiar ambition to bring the restless peninsula to heel. Their envoys spoke of friendship. Their armies soon followed. Within the capital, factions multiplied. Noble families who traced their ancestry to the founding tribes feuded over privilege. Generals commanded more loyalty than ministers. Ministers answered to none but their own clans. The throne, once the seat of divine authority, became the axis of intrigue. Kings rose and fell through whispers rather than wars. Despite decay, the facade of greatness endured. Processions still wound through Pyongyang's avenues on festival days. Musicians played before an audience that listened out of memory rather than joy. Scholars debated law and ritual as if reason alone could postpone collapse. In this ritualized calm, the empire drifted toward its reckoning. When the northern Shi probed the border in the 6th century, Goguryeo repelled them with the stubborn valor that had built its legend. Yet each victory cost more than it restored. Villages along the Yalu were abandoned to feed the army. Bridges were burned to deny passage to foes who never came. Defense had become exhaustion by another name. Then came the rise of the Sui dynasty, whose emperors sought to reunite China and extend their dominion to every frontier. They viewed Goguryeo not as neighbor, but as test, a chance to display imperial inevitability. Armies of staggering size gathered along the Liao River, boasting of divine favor and limitless supply. In the spring of AD 612, their invasion began. The sky darkened with banners. The sound of drums carried for miles. Chroniclers wrote that 500,000 men marched under the Sui's command, though even exaggeration could not capture the weight of that advance. Against them stood a fraction of that number, hardened soldiers led by a general whose name would outlive his kings, Gulji Mundeok. He was a strategist of silence. Where the enemy expected resistance, he offered retreat. When they advanced, he yielded ground. When they rested, he struck. Rivers were dammed and released. Bridges sabotaged. Supplies vanished into mist. The invaders, certain of easy conquest, found themselves wandering through a land that devoured them. At the Battle of Salsu, Ilji's deception reached perfection. Pretending flight, he lured the Sui across a river dammed upstream. When the waters were unleashed, the flood swept away tens of thousands. The survivors, starving and broken, fled north. Out of the immense army that had crossed the frontier, only a remnant returned. The victory saved the kingdom, but it could not save its future. Triumph against the Sui drained the last reserves of men and will. Fields lay fallow, treasuries hollowed by the cost of defense. Even as Pyongyang celebrated, famine haunted the borders. The general retired in quiet honor, but the court that praised him learned nothing from his restraint. In the decades that followed, Goguryeo turned inward, ruled by suspicion more than wisdom. Kings feared their generals. Nobles distrusted the throne. Attempts at reform collapsed under the weight of pride. Meanwhile, new threats emerged beyond the sea. Silla's steady ascent, Baekje's persistence, and the revival of Chinese unity under the Tang dynasty. The contrast was cruel. While Silla refined its institutions and Baekje rekindled art, Goguryeo clung to ceremony and fortress. Its armies remained formidable, but its spirit had calcified. The younger kingdoms spoke of destiny. The old empire spoke only of precedent. By the mid-7th century, its rulers faced the truth their ancestors had foreseen but never admitted. A realm cannot live forever by memory. Alliances with Baekje provided fleeting respite, yet both powers were declining, bound together by desperation rather than fraternity. When the Tang sent envoys proposing peace, the northern court received them with arrogance. The ambassadors saw crumbling walls and empty streets, yet they reported to their emperor that the old tiger still bared teeth. The Tang resolved to strike. But before foreign armies crossed the border, the kingdom wounded itself. The rise of Gojoseon, a general of ruthless brilliance, turned the court into his battlefield. Seizing power through assassination, he ruled in the king's name, but by his own law. For nearly 2 decades, his dictatorship held the nation together through fear. Roads were repaired, armies drilled, temples endowed, but the harmony was illusion. Upon his death, his sons quarreled, dividing the army and the land. By then, Gogaryeo's fate was sealed. The Tang and Silla alliance gathered beyond the mountains, patient as the tide. The empire that had once defied empires found itself alone, surrounded by the echo of its own legend. As winter returned, snow covered the great walls of Pyongyang. The falcon that had once circled above the city's towers was gone. Only ravens remained, their cries cutting through the cold. The people still performed the rites of victory, though none remembered what victory felt like. In the silence that followed, one might still imagine the wind passing over the tomb of Goguryeo, carrying with it the faintest sound of his triumphs. But it was no longer applause. It was remembrance, an empire listening to the echo of itself, fading at last into history's long and patient night. Storm clouds gathered not from the sea, but from the west. Across the Yellow River, the Tang dynasty had risen, brilliant, disciplined, and hungry. Its banners of vermilion silk carried both scripture and sword. To the kingdoms of the peninsula, the reappearance of a unified China was both omen and opportunity. In Silla, the throne passed to Queen Seondeok, the daughter of a line that had ruled by faith more than force. She inherited a realm surrounded by enemies, Baekje to the west, Goguryeo to the north, and the Tang Empire beyond the sea. Yet her mind, subtle and unflinching, saw patterns where others saw peril. She believed that survival would come not from strength, but from wisdom, the art of choosing the right moment to risk everything. Her reign began under doubt. Many nobles resisted a woman's rule, and border lords whispered of revolt. Yet the queen answered not with purges, but with vision. She filled the capital with builders, astronomers, and monks, transforming Gyeongju into a city of intellect. The great observatory of Gyeongseongdae rose from the plain, a tower of stone aligned with the stars. It was more than science. It was declaration that Silla would read the heavens itself before bowing to any earthly power. Still, the heavens did not grant peace. To the west, Baekje's King Weija expanded aggressively, seizing fortresses and threatening Silla's heartland. To the north, Goguryeo's generals tested old borders, emboldened by Silla's perceived weakness. Surrounded and outnumbered, the queen turned to a distant ally whose appetite matched her ambition. Envoys crossed the sea to the Tang court, carrying letters sealed with gold. Their message was simple. Silla would recognize Tang's supremacy in return for aid against her foes. Emperor Taizong, ever the strategist, accepted with cautious delight. For him, the alliance offered a foothold in the peninsula. For Silla, it promised survival at a price yet unknown. The first joint campaigns began in AD 645, when Tang armies clashed with Goguryeo forces along the Liao River. Silla provided intelligence and supply routes, testing the new alliance from a distance. The war faltered, but the pattern was set. Silla would fight with wit, letting others exhaust themselves before committing fully. After Seondeok's death, the crown passed to her cousin, Queen Jindeok, who deepened the pact with Tang. Under her rule, monks fluent in Chinese doctrine acted as diplomats, weaving faith and politics into one tapestry. When she died without heir, the court turned to a man whose courage matched their queen's foresight, King Muyol, once the general Kim Chun-chu. Muyol was pragmatic, patient, and utterly convinced that unification was destiny. He nurtured the Tang alliance carefully, sending tribute and scholars while gathering his armies in silence. By then, the Tang Emperor Gaozong had inherited his father's ambition and sought to extend it across the sea. Their interests converged perfectly. Silla's dream of unity and Tang's vision of empire. In AD 660, the storm broke. Tang fleets crossed the Bohai Gulf, while Silla's forces, led by General Kim Yushin, advanced overland toward Baekje. The campaign was brutal, swift, and decisive. At Hwangsanbeol, Silla's army met Baekje's last defenders, warriors led by the valiant General Gyebaek, who fought knowing his cause was lost. The chronicles speak of his final speech to his men, that loyalty, not victory, defines honor. When he fell, Baekje's spirit fell with him. The capital of Sabi was taken soon after, its royal family captured, its temples looted, its courtiers exiled or slain. Yet even in defeat, Baekje's dignity endured. Resistance continued under the Baekje Restoration Army, supported by Japan's Yamato court. Their banners fluttered along the coastlines for years, a stubborn echo of a vanished kingdom. For Silla, victory was both triumph and burden. The alliance that had raised it to power now threatened to consume it. Tang generals occupied the conquered territories, establishing military command posts under the pretext of administration. Their banners flew beside Silla's in cities that had never known Tang rule. King Muyol, weary from the war, died before seeing the full weight of this betrayal. His successor, King Munmu, and his trusted general, Kim Yushin, understood that peace with Tang was illusion. The dragon had crossed the sea, not to aid, but to claim. Still, for the moment, Silla endured its partner's arrogance with smiles. Tribute flowed eastward. Temples were built in Tang style. The court spoke of gratitude, even as spies counted garrisons and measured roads. Gyeongju glittered, its palaces adorned with Chinese lacquer and gold, while beyond its walls, soldiers trained for an inevitable reckoning. Meanwhile, the last remnants of Baekje's faithful gathered around the monk commander Doshim and the prince Buyeo-pung. They struck from the south, rallying villages that refused to accept foreign rule. Though their numbers were small, their defiance stirred the hearts of many who feared that Korea itself was vanishing beneath foreign banners. In these years, Kim Yushin became legend. A soldier of austere virtue, he carried both sword and rosary, believing that victory and salvation were the same pursuit. Under his leadership, Silla's armies moved like prayers answered. Each battle was calculated, each retreat deliberate. His discipline transformed a provincial kingdom into the finest army the peninsula had seen. The final Baekje uprising ended in fire. Its fortresses fell one by one, until only embers remained along the river valleys. Captured nobles were treated not as barbarians, but as brothers lost to time. Many were integrated into Silla's administration. Others chose exile in the Tang Empire or across the sea. The land that had once been the cradle of grace was now province of another's design. Silla's rise was complete, yet the shadow of Tang loomed larger with every victory. In Pyongyang, Goguryeo still held firm, defiant as ever. To conquer the peninsula, Silla would again need its dragon ally, and risk its own independence anew. In Gyeongju's royal hall, under lamps of bronze and silk, the aging Kim Yushin knelt before King Munmu. To unite the land, he said, we must first lose our fear of the sky. The king nodded, understanding that heaven's favor was not granted. It was claimed. Outside, spring rain fell over the city. Roads were slick with mud and blossoms. The kingdom stood poised between deliverance and danger, its banners bright against the grey horizon. The gamble that had begun with a queen's vision now reached its turning point. Silla had won the war for survival. The war for the soul of the peninsula had only begun. Autumn came late that year. The hills along the Taedong River glowed with copper leaves, and the air carried the scent of smoke from distant forges. Within the citadel of Pyongyang, the court of Goguryeo met in uneasy silence. Messengers arrived daily, their faces grey with travel, bringing news that was always the same. The walls were holding, but the spirit was not. The once mighty kingdom had survived invasions that broke empires. It had outlasted the Han commanderies, humbled the Sui, and matched the early Tang blow for blow. Yet the threat that now consumed it came not from abroad, but from within. When Yeon Gaesomun, the formidable general who ruled in the king's name, died suddenly, the balance that had held the realm together dissolved. His sons quarreled over succession. The army divided its loyalties. Provinces withheld tribute, waiting to see which brother would triumph. What had been tyranny turned to chaos, and from that chaos came ruin. In the early summer of AD 667, Silla and Tang struck together. From the south, Silla's legions marched under Kim Yushin, hardened by decades of campaigns. From the north, Tang forces advanced across the Liao, their banners glittering with imperial emblems. Between them lay the exhausted body of Goguryeo, defended by soldiers who no longer trusted one another. The first battles were desperate but disciplined. Fortresses fell, retaken, and fell again. Commanders acted with valor and despair in equal measure. Even divided, the northern army fought as if each man bore the memory of a greater age upon his shoulders. The invaders met resistance in every valley, ambush in every pass. But unity had gone out of the kingdom. Courage without command could not sustain it. The Tang general Li Shiji drove his armies along the western river plains, constructing bridges as fast as they were destroyed. His engineers moved with mechanical precision, while Silla's troops swept through the southeastern frontier. Each day brought another province under joint control. Messages sent from Pyongyang often arrived too late. Orders contradicted themselves. The center no longer held. In the capital, King Bojang, weary and uncertain, presided over ceremonies that had lost their meaning. Priests chanted for divine favor, while ministers plotted escape. The palace, once resounding with drums and horns, echoed instead with the distant thud of siege engines. Citizens whispered that even the spirits of their ancestors had turned away. By the spring of AD 668, the Tang and Silla armies converged on Pyongyang. The city's walls, built by generations who had believed them eternal, now stood blackened by fire. For 3 months, the defenders endured bombardment, starvation, and betrayal. One by one, gates fell, each breach a wound that could not heal. When the final assault came, there were no reserves left to call upon, only the memory of pride. Chronicles record that King Bojang rode to the walls in full armor, though he could not lift his sword. His attendants urged flight. Instead, he watched the horizon until the banners of Tang appeared through the haze. There, in the roar of collapsing stone, an empire ended. The victors moved with methodical efficiency. Tang officers claimed the citadel. Silla's banners were allowed beside theirs for ceremony's sake. Records were seized, prisoners catalogued, the wealth of centuries inventoried like spoils of archaeology. The conquerors found in Pyongyang libraries of scrolls, bronze statues of ancestors, and tombs so vast they mistook them for palaces. The empire they had destroyed astonished even them. When the fires subsided, the river carried its reflection of ruin downstream. Entire families of scholars and craftsmen were taken north into China, as hostages or guests, depending on the chronicler. Soldiers who surrendered were absorbed into Tang's ranks, sent west to garrison foreign lands. Others fled east to the mountains, vowing that Goguryeo lived wherever they stood. Among them was a minor officer named Dai Jo-yong, son of a tribal chieftain. He would one day found Balhae, the successor kingdom that kept alive the northern spirit. But that belonged to another story, still unwritten in this moment of ash and silence. For now, the peninsula lay transformed. Silla, though triumphant, found itself bound to its vast ally's shadow. The Tang court established commanderies in the conquered territories, naming their new dominion the Protectorate General to pacify the East. The words promised stewardship, but the meaning was occupation. In Gyeongju, the news of victory arrived amid celebration that quickly turned to unease. The dream of unification was close, but the price was sovereignty. The dragon that had helped to slay the northern giant now coiled across its lands, unwilling to depart. Back in Pyongyang, smoke rose for weeks. Survivors buried the dead where they fell, marking graves with stones rather than names. Monks recited sutras for the souls of both victors and vanquished. One chronicler wrote that the silence after the siege was so deep, even the crows forgot to speak. When the Tang Emperor's envoys reported success, they spoke of conquest in terms of restoration, claiming that the peninsula had returned to the order of heaven. But those who had lived through it knew differently. Goguryeo had not been restored to anything. It had been erased. Its fall ended an epoch that had begun with legends of divine archers and sky-born kings. The fortress empire of the north, once guardian of 1,000 miles of mountain and plain, now existed only in the echo of its murals and the endurance of its people scattered across foreign lands. Autumn turned to winter again. The Taedong froze, smooth as polished stone. The ruins of Pyongyang lay beneath frost, and the moon rose over empty watchtowers. In its light, the outlines of the fallen city gleamed faintly, an afterimage of greatness. The wind moved through broken gates, and the sound was neither lament nor victory, only history exhaling the breath of an empire finally at rest. Drums beat again before the wounds of war had healed. The banners that had once flown beside Silla's in brotherhood now advanced against them. Along the river valleys and mountain passes, soldiers recognized the colors of their former allies and understood too late that deliverance had come wrapped in conquest. After the fall of Goguryeo, the Tang Empire claimed the peninsula as its reward. Imperial commissioners carved it into provinces, their new dominion called the Protectorate General to pacify the East. The phrase sounded benevolent. The reality was occupation. Chinese governors took residence in Pyongyang and the lands of former Baekje. Garrisons lined the roads Silla had built, their standards bearing the golden dragon of Tang. In Gyeongju, King Munmu, successor of the late King Muyol, received the news in silence. The alliance that had delivered unification now threatened to erase it. Envoys from the Tang court brought letters filled with polite deceit. Congratulations on victory, instructions on obedience. The young king read them, folded them carefully, and began preparing for another war. At his side stood General Kim Yushin, grey-haired but unbroken. Together they gathered the remnants of Silla's army, veterans tempered by years of struggle. "We once fought to reclaim our land," the general told his captains. "Now we fight to keep it." The Tang underestimated their former partner. They believed Silla too small, too indebted to resist. Imperial officials planned the integration of the peninsula as if arranging a ceremony, unaware that beneath their feet a new resistance was already taking form. In the western provinces, local chieftains who had served Baekje rose again, rallying to Silla's cause. Old rivalries dissolved before a shared enemy. Monks carried messages disguised as prayers. Farmers hid weapons among their harvests. Across valleys and coasts, the cry spread. Korea, for Koreans. The first clashes came swiftly. At Maeseok Pass, Silla's forces ambushed a Tang detachment moving to secure the southern roads. The battle was brief and brutal. Tang soldiers, trained for open plains, found themselves trapped in narrow ravines. Archers from the cliffs rained death with the precision of faith. When the smoke cleared, the survivors fled north, leaving armor and banners behind. That victory ignited the war of liberation. For the next 8 years, the peninsula became a shifting theater of ambush and endurance. Silla's soldiers fought like ghosts, appearing and vanishing among the mountains they knew by heart. The Tang, frustrated and far from their supply lines, discovered that empire could not hold terrain whose people refused to kneel. King Munmu, both ruler and strategist, balanced battle with diplomacy. He sent letters to Tang's generals written in the language of courtesy, but laced with defiance. "You came as guests. Do not mistake our hospitality for surrender." The words circulated even among Tang's troops, unsettling men who had begun to doubt the purpose of their campaign. While armies clashed, monks in Gyeongju prayed daily for peace. Temples rang their bells, not in celebration, but in warning. The capital became both sanctuary and forge. Women wove banners for the troops. Children carried messages between garrisons, and blacksmiths worked by torchlight. The entire kingdom, from noble to peasant, moved with one heartbeat. The Tang emperor sent reinforcements from the mainland, hoping to crush rebellion through sheer magnitude. But distance was Silla's ally. Storms wrecked fleets crossing the Yellow Sea. Supply caravans vanished into fog. The empire that spanned deserts and mountains faltered before the persistence of a single small nation. By AD 675, the tide had turned. At Chiljung Fortress and Goguryeo's old northern strongholds, Silla's armies struck with decisive precision. Former enemies, soldiers of Baekje and Goguryeo, now fought under the same banner. Their divisions burned away by shared defiance. Chronicles tell of monks blessing the troops before battle, chanting sutras until the ground itself seemed to tremble. Kim Yushin, aged yet relentless, led from the front. He no longer sought glory, only conclusion. In one letter to the king, he wrote, "The empire across the sea commands 1,000 armies, but heaven favors those who defend their home." When he died soon after the final campaigns, his ashes were placed by royal order near the sea, facing the waters from which the invaders had come. By AD 676, Tang's forces withdrew beyond the Taedong River. Their officials, who had ruled with arrogance, departed under escort, leaving behind their monuments half-finished. The war had cost thousands of lives and uncounted temples, but for the first time, the peninsula stood under one native crown. The dream that had haunted kings for centuries had become reality, though not through unity of conquest, but unity of resistance. Victory did not bring exaltation. The fields were scarred, cities half-emptied, and families scattered. The court declared mourning for both friend and foe. In Gyeongju's temples, prayers were recited for the souls of all who had died, Tang and Korean alike. The new state called itself Unified Silla, yet those who built it knew unity was never simple. It had to be renewed with every breath. King Munmu reigned as the first ruler of a peninsula truly free. He refused the Tang offer of imperial titles, writing in reply, "The sea protects us, heaven judges us." No other master is needed, his humility masked resolve. Under his command, Silla's borders stabilized along the Taedong, and fortresses were rebuilt not for expansion but for vigilance. Legends say that when Munmu lay dying, he asked to be buried in the sea, that he might guard his realm as a dragon against future invaders. Whether true or not, fishermen along the coast swore that on stormy nights, a glimmering shape moved beneath the waves, neither fish nor spirit, but the soul of a king keeping his watch. In the years that followed, peace returned like a stranger learning how to speak again. The peninsula, weary from centuries of division, began to heal. Temples rose where fortresses had stood, and villages sprouted from fields once soaked in blood. Silla, the smallest of the ancient kingdoms, had outlasted them all, not by size or fortune, but by endurance of will. When the last Tang ships vanished beyond the horizon, the people gathered along the coast to watch the sea reclaim their wake. No cheers, no vengeance, only a long exhale, as if the land itself was breathing for the first time. What remained was fragile but whole, a single nation drawn from the ashes of three. The dragon had departed, and the hills of the south once more belonged to themselves. A bell tolled in Gyeongju, its resonance rolling across the hills like a wave of bronze. The sound marked no warning and no victory. It marked time itself. For the first time in living memory, Korea breathed without war. Under unified Silla, the peninsula entered an age that later generations would remember as golden. The fields of the south ripened undisturbed, cities filled with artisans and monks instead of soldiers. The scars of division faded beneath stone and prayer. What centuries of conquest had failed to achieve, endurance had made possible. King Sinmun, son of the sea-born Munmu, began the work of transformation. He reorganized the land into 9 provinces and 5 capitals, a structure that joined mountains, coasts, and plains under a single system of governance. Fortresses became administrative centers. Garrisons became towns. The throne sent inspectors to the farthest borders, ensuring that unity was not only a word, but a presence. The court grew luminous with confidence. Scholars debated the ethics of rule, blending Confucian discipline with Buddhist compassion. Temples received royal patronage. Monasteries doubled as schools where sons of nobles and commoners alike studied philosophy, astronomy, and law. Knowledge itself had become a form of devotion. The capital reflected this new harmony between earth and spirit. Palaces of wood and tile rose beside shimmering ponds. Markets thrived with merchants from Tang, China, and the islands of Japan, their ships moored along the southeastern harbors. At sunset, the streets filled with incense smoke and the murmur of prayer. Travelers called Gyeongju the City of Gold, not for its riches, but for the light that gilded every roof at dusk. It was during this era that Buddhism became the kingdom's language of beauty. Temples such as Bulguksa rose with pillars carved like lotus stems, stairways ascending toward enlightenment in stone. Within its halls stood the Seokguram Grotto, a sanctuary carved into the mountainside where a serene Buddha gazed eternally toward the east. The sculptors who built it left no names, believing anonymity itself an offering. When the first dawn light touched that face of granite compassion, the entire kingdom seemed to bow with it. Prosperity encouraged art in every form. Poets wrote of the transience of joy and the holiness of restraint. Goldsmiths fashioned crowns shaped like trees and antlers, symbols of a heritage that remembered the shaman kings of old. Potters created celadon wares so translucent that candlelight glowed through them like breath. Even music changed. Melodies slowed, instruments softened, and rhythm gave way to resonance. Civilization had turned contemplative, but peace brings its own tests. As the centuries turned, Silla's aristocracy grew in wealth and certainty. The bone rank system, once a framework for order, hardened into privilege. High-born families occupied the court like constellations that never moved, their lineage more powerful than the laws meant to restrain them. Below them, scholars and soldiers murmured of justice unrealized. The hierarchy that had preserved stability now sowed quiet resentment. Despite this, the kingdom's radiance endured. Trade routes stretched westward to Tang and southward to the maritime kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Embassies traveled regularly to Chang'an, bearing tribute and philosophy alike. Tang envoys wrote admiringly of Silla's civility, its temples cleaner and its laws stricter than their own. For a time, Korea was not pupil, but equal, an independent voice in Asia's chorus of empires. Religion shaped politics as deeply as it shaped art. Monks advised kings, interpreting omens and ethics alike. The concept of the compassionate ruler became state ideal. To govern as a bodhisattva governs the world, serving not self but harmony. Under that vision, punishment softened, taxation grew more balanced, and roads were built to connect every province with the capital's beating heart. Pilgrims crossed seas and deserts to reach India, bringing back relics and stories. Among them was the monk Hyecho, who journeyed through the lands of the Buddha and wrote of distant deserts, strange tongues, and the universality of suffering. His travelogue, preserved in fragments, remains the whisper of Silla's curiosity, reaching beyond its mountains. In this flourishing, the peninsula's ancient divisions found new purpose. Former Baekje lands became the cradle of artisans. The northern regions of old Goguryeo provided soldiers and scholars. Silla's unity was not erasure, but integration, a mosaic assembled from difference. The people learned to call themselves not tribes or kingdoms, but simply Hanin, people of one land. Yet beneath the calm, change gathered like unseen tide. The monarchy's moral authority waned as noble clans tightened their grasp on wealth and power. Monasteries grew vast and affluent, rivaling the state itself. The same faith that had once sanctified kingship now offered refuge from its decay. In the eyes of peasants, monks became truer guardians of compassion than those on the throne. Even so, the spirit of the age lingered bright. The 8th century's artists and thinkers believed themselves living at the center of the world's balance. They were not wrong. The peninsula, once torn by ambition, now radiated culture outward like light through silk. One court poet wrote, "The wind of peace has weight. It bends even iron." Those words captured the soul of unified Silla, a nation that learned to forge permanence not from conquest, but from quiet mastery. As evening settled over Gyeongju, lamps glowed along the colonnades of Bulguksa, their reflections trembling on water as smooth as glass. The monks' chants rose and fell with the rhythm of waves meeting shore. In that mingling of light and sound, one could feel the presence of centuries, the ache, the labor, the grace that had made such calm possible. For a moment, it seemed that history itself had paused, content to listen. But even in its twilight, unified Silla remained beautiful. Travelers approaching Gyeongju in the late 8th century still saw golden spires rising above the rice fields, still heard temple bells drifting across the valley at dawn. The capital seemed unchanged, yet the stillness concealed decay. The kingdom that had united the land now struggled to govern itself. Peace, once the fruit of endurance, had ripened into complacency. The same nobility that had served kings in hardship now ruled them in prosperity. Great families, their names stretching back to the founders, accumulated estates vast as provinces. Ministers debated ritual while peasants left their farms to escape tax and conscription. The harmony of old had curdled into hierarchy. Kings still performed the ancient rites, offerings at Namsan, prayers for rain, the reading of the sutras, but their words carried less conviction. The bone rank system that had sustained order for centuries now suffocated it. Ambition found no outlet but rebellion, and faith, once the realm's compass, retreated behind monastery walls. By the early 9th century, Silla's bureaucracy had become both its glory and its prison. The civil administration remained unmatched in sophistication. The roads, temples, and archives still functioned. Yet each reform, intended to preserve balance, instead exposed fracture. Local governors behaved as lords in all but name. The palace whispered of treason more often than of poetry. It was an age of subtle collapse, where beauty endured longer than virtue. The city glittered while the countryside starved. Bands of dispossessed farmers gathered under wandering monks and outlaws, calling themselves the people of the true dawn. Their banners bore prayers rather than emblems, but they fought with desperate strength. In the reign of King Hyondeok, the first open uprisings flared. Villages refused to deliver grain. Temples fortified themselves against tax collectors. The government answered with decrees and pardons, alternating mercy with fear. Each concession bought months, not peace. The 9th century unfolded in cycles of rebellion and reprieve. Yet even as authority faltered, culture persisted. Artists still carved Buddhas into cliff faces. Poets still wrote of transience with elegance that bordered on acceptance. In their verses, one hears resignation more than grief, a belief that all empires must pass, as all seasons do. The kingdom's decline was not sudden, but tidal. To the west, the provinces that had once belonged to Baekje remembered their independence. In the north, descendants of Goguryeo whispered of forgotten glory. The unity achieved through centuries of struggle was dissolving back into its elements. When King Yongmun ascended the throne in the mid-9th century, he sought to restore vigor. He repaired fortresses, appointed new ministers, and proclaimed moral renewal. Yet every act of reform tightened the knot of opposition. The nobles resented interference. Monks feared taxation. Even the loyal grew weary of decrees that changed nothing. Beyond the borders, new powers were stirring. The descendants of Goguryeo's exiles had founded Balhae, a northern kingdom that traded silk for furs and letters with Tang China as an equal. Its embassies passed through Silla's lands with courteous disdain, reminders that Korea's northern soul had not vanished. To the west, the Tang itself was fracturing under warlords and rebellion. The age of centralized empires was ending, and Silla, for all its learning, could not escape that gravity. When King Haeongang came to power, even the throne's sanctity was questioned. Provincial magnates minted their own coins and levied armies. The royal court, trapped between pride and helplessness, alternated between bribes and pilgrimages. The monks prayed louder, the peasants listened less. The final unraveling came in the 10th century. In the south, a soldier named Gyeon Hwon, claiming descent from Baekje's royal line, seized the city of Wonsan and proclaimed the birth of later Baekje. To the north, the charismatic Goguryeo, a self-proclaimed monk king, gathered followers among disillusioned farmers and founded later Goguryeo, later renamed Taebong. Between them lay the weary remnant of Silla, hemmed in and hollow. The peninsula once more echoed with the clash of banners, the later three kingdoms. Yet these wars felt different, less crusades of destiny than struggles of exhaustion. Each claimant invoked the past to justify the present, but none commanded the faith that had once made kings divine. In Gyeongju, the royal court maintained ceremony, even as couriers brought news of defeat. The king's processions continued, though the crowds had thinned to curiosity. The drums beat, but the rhythm was hollow. Ministers debated omens. Astrologers blamed the stars. Only the monks kept their composure, reminding all who listened that impermanence is the law of heaven. Still, within this decline flickered transformation. As the old order crumbled, new ideas emerged. Merchants gained influence. Regional leaders governed with efficiency born of necessity. The rigid bone ranks system began to lose meaning. For the first time, men of modest birth rose through merit rather than ancestry. The decay of the past prepared the soil for renewal. Among the northern rebels rose a leader who would end the chaos not by imitation, but by synthesis. Goguryeo, a naval commander from the Taebong realm, combined the discipline of Silla with the heritage of Goguryeo and the pragmatism of Baekje's merchants. He fought less to conquer than to stabilize, offering clemency where others demanded submission. Villagers opened their gates to him. Monks blessed his banners. He called his new realm Goguryeo, invoking the name of the North's ancient kingdom as symbol of rebirth. In AD 935, the last Silla monarch, Queen Jinseong, weary of conflict, sent envoys to Goguryeo camp. The message contained neither plea nor defiance, only recognition that her time had passed. When she stepped down from the throne, no uprising followed. The people accepted the change as the turning of a season. Her abdication ended more than a dynasty. It ended an epoch that had shaped the soul of Korea. From Gojoseon's ashes to Silla's surrender, 1,000 years had carved one identity from three. The peninsula, once divided by mountains and rival gods, now shared a single continuity. Under Goguryeo, temples of Silla remained standing, their bells still tolling across familiar hills. Monks recited sutras for the souls of the fallen kingdoms, not in mourning, but in gratitude. The stones of Bulguksa gleamed as they always had, bearing witness that even in impermanence, beauty endures. Historians later wrote that Silla died peacefully, and in that peace lay its greatest achievement. It had taught the land how to be whole. Its kings had learned restraint where others sought expansion. Its people had discovered unity not in conquest, but in endurance. From that endurance flowed the language, art, and faith that would define Korea's spirit for centuries. When evening falls upon Gyeongju today, the hills glow softly in the last light. Beneath their slopes lie tombs of kings and queens, each mound a heartbeat of the past. The grass bends with the wind, and the air still carries the scent of pine and incense. No banners fly, no drums resound, yet something of that ancient rhythm remains, the pulse of a civilization that learned how to end without vanishing. The age of Silla was over, but the memory of its harmony had already become the foundation of everything that followed.